President Trump going on a Twitter tirade, that after Michael Flynn pleads guilty and cooperates with a Russia probe. We're going to ask a former federal prosecutor if he just made a bad situation even worse. Then Republicans in the Senate, they pass a tax bill in the dead of night and slip in all sorts of surprises. Well, we'll take a look at what's in it and the politics used to pass it. And President Trump finally endorses Roy Moore. That about a week after he voiced support for the Alabama Senate candidate who was accused of molesting young girls, some as young as 14. How will the president's move impact that race and, on a broader level, the GOP? Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us on what has been a very busy last few days. President Trump, he was quiet on Friday. That when Michael Flynn pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI. But since then, well, he's had quite a bit to say. Here he is just this morning.
I feel badly for General Flynn. I feel very badly. He's led a very strong life, and I feel very badly, John. I will say this. Hillary Clinton lied many times to the FBI. Nothing happened to her. Flynn lied, and they destroyed his life. I think it's a shame.
And we get this tweet from Saturday, and it's getting a lot of attention, but not the type the president is welcoming. And I'll read this verbatim. Quote, "I had to fire General Flynn because he lied to the vice president and the FBI. He has pled guilty to those lies. It is a shame because his actions during the transition were lawful. There was nothing to hide!" Exclamation point. On Sunday, the president's attorney, we'll get into that, John Dowd, said he posted the tweet I just read. It wasn't the president, even though it was, obviously, as you saw, on the president's Twitter account. This after a firestorm over the content of it. The tweet admitted for the first time that the president knew Flynn committed a felony, lying to the FBI when he told James Comey to go easy on Flynn. No wonder Dowd took credit. And now CNN is reporting that the White House chief lawyer told the president in January, remember that date, that he believed Flynn had lied to the FBI and Pence and deserved to be terminated. Now, this whole thing is reigniting the debate over whether or not the president directly obstructed justice. Go to the aforementioned John Dowd, one of the president's attorneys. He said that's impossible for a president. Here's what he told Axios. The president cannot obstruct justice because he is the chief law enforcement officer and he has every right to express his view of any case. Well, to many people, that sounded Nixonian. If you want a reminder, here is Richard Nixon after he resigned during the legendary Frost-Nixon interviews. Take a listen.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal. By definition. Exactly.
Yes, we are in that kind of territory. Former federal prosecutor Mimi Rocha is here to help us sort this out, or try to. There's so much here, Mimi. Usually Monday's a little bit slower, but not with this. Okay, so let's, before we get into obstruction and everything else, let's unpack what we learned, and the timeline, I think, is significant. We'll talk about Flynn's participation and his plea and the significance in a second, but over the course of this weekend and then advanced today, the president's own attorney, I'll temper my cynicism for a minute, puts out here that, yes, he lied to not just me, but he lied to the FBI, which runs counter to everything that the president said in terms of when he learned of it. He said when he discovered it, he terminated him right away. Now we're learning that back in January, the White House's own counsel told the president that Flynn had lied about all the meetings with the Russians, etc. To that point, what does that do to recast the conversation that allegedly happened between President Trump and also Jim Comey about going easy on Flynn, making this go away, and the whole loyalty pledge?
Right. So what it does is it moves Mueller's investigation one step closer to an obstruction charge, putting aside for a moment the question of whether and when the president could be charged with that, a sitting president. Because, look, obstruction, there's no question. I guess Trump is now disputing to a certain extent, but there seems to be little reasonable debate about whether or not Trump told Comey and other people to go easy on Flynn, if you will. And there's no question that he, because of the position of power of who he is, that could have had a great influence on the people that he said that to in sum and substance. So the question is, what was his intent? What was in his mind? What was he thinking? What was the purpose? Was it corrupt? That's the sort of phrase that the statutes, the obstruction of justice statutes use. They look for corrupt intent. And if Trump knew at the time that he gave those, let's call them directions, because coming from someone like him, that's really what they were, even if they were phrased as requests. At the time he gave those directions, he knew that Flynn had already lied to the FBI, therefore committed a felony. Then that shows that that gives you a window to his state of mind.
And there's more layers to this, where some prior statements that were made all of a sudden now have more context. Katie McFarland, who people may remember her name, she wrote in December, a year ago, that Russia had, quote, thrown the U.S. presidential election to Trump, and while the meaning may be unclear or not, all of us, and this was intended to the inner circle of the administration, that this has to deal with sanctions and how we handle this and everything else. Whatever benefit of the doubt the administration may have gotten, and whatever insularity they could have had, because this would have been from lower level folks or people they call coffee boys and all the rest, like they tried to label Papadopoulos, the circle is getting closer and closer. And the idea of plausible deniability that they didn't know what was going on, whether it be the president or his closest aides, is getting harder and harder to stomach right now. It's tightening, isn't it?
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, the now public official court documents, you know, they don't name the people, but they call them, you know, they give them titles that they're I forget the exact title, but it's high-ranking, you know, people involved in the campaign. There's reporting out there that one of those people may be Jared Kushner. We don't know that for sure, but it certainly seems plausible in light of, you know, things that we've learned.
We don't know the answer to this next question, so I'm not asking you to divine this, but there is a lot of debate as to what Michael Flynn was charged with, what he wasn't charged with, how significant what he may or may not have already shared here with the Mueller team is. But if you have to read the tea leaves a little bit, it seems as if he's got some really significant information that has mitigated possibly what he has been charged with and what he may or may not be additionally charged with going forward.
Right. So, I mean, we could spend a long time talking about what, you know, what he pled to and sort of what that shows us. It is, you know, true that normally a cooperator like Flynn would have to plead to all the criminal conduct that he's ever committed. That's sort of the way that it's done in most federal districts in the country. Not all, some do it differently, but certainly here in the Southern District of New York, and I believe in the Eastern District of New York, where some of the prosecutors who are on Mueller's team have come from. That said, what he's pled to is 1001. It's a serious crime. He has immunity, so he can't be further prosecuted for that crime and for at least some of the FARA violations. There may be other conduct out there that he's committed. It may be that there's more to come in terms of what Flynn will eventually plead to. Maybe they, for now, you know, this is what was sort of readily provable. They wanted to get something, get Flynn on board, so to speak, and without revealing the whole story right now, because to have him plead to more would reveal more of the story. So I think that's one cautionary tale to people who are out there saying, oh, this is all he pled to, you know, this has nothing to do with Russia.
And his son wasn't mentioned, which was, by all accounts, significant here in the decision by Mr. Flynn, his son's potential exposure in all of this. There's no immunity in that agreement for him.
There's no immunity for that. There's no immunity for a lot of the other things that we've heard reporting. Now, I'm not saying those are proven facts. I'm not saying he should have gotten immunity, but it would seem that those are going to have to play out one way or the other. He's actually going to at some point need coverage for those or plead guilty to those.
And he's incentivized to be as cooperating as possible, especially, as you said, with allegations ranging from money laundering to even potentially worse that's out there in a big way. Now, the president said something, or Mr. Dowd reiterated that a president basically, you know, as Nixon said, you know, can't be charged with a crime here because he's the president, obstruction included. Is that how it works?
What Dowd was saying, actually, was even more outrageous than that. He was saying the president could not have committed obstruction here because he's allowed to fire the FBI director for any reason. So what's the problem, basically? And that can't be right, that the president is immune from the obstruction statute. What if the president threatened a witness? What if he falsified a court document? I'm not saying he did any of those things, but if you use those extreme examples, of course he would not be sort of immune, for any conduct whatsoever that could possibly constitute obstruction.
So if you've learned anything, and certainly Mueller's played his cards very close to the vest here, in terms of how this investigation is unfolding and where they're going, does it seem that he's going in the direction of obstruction? Is that seem to be the direction as to where he's going to, wherever the chips fall, that's where the high crime, if you will, is that he's pursuing?
I think it seems that way right now, and I don't think that's at all a minor crime. I mean, I think, people are charged with obstruction and lying to the FBI every day across America, and they're very serious crimes, whether or not there was an underlying crime. Martha Stewart is probably the most famous example of that. I mean, she was convicted of lying to the FBI. There was never an underlying crime that was charged or proven. And people debated whether that should have happened. But those are our laws, and that's how the court system works. It relies on the integrity not only of the prosecutors and investigators, but of the witnesses and people that they're talking to. And when that's corrupted, we got a real problem. So I think even if that's the only direction where Mueller is going, I think that's, a good place for him to be going. And, thank God we have people like Mueller who are, focused on facts and evidence. And I think that's the important thing that we're seeing here. I think Flynn is probably a large key to that, though. And he's talking to Mueller. He's already been talking. And I'm sure they're continuing to talk to him and to follow up on leads and corroborate information he's giving them. And he's the window into what was happening there. And
there's going to be a whole lot of people with a lot of self-interest. They're going to have some conversations with the feds. So obviously everyone's got their own agendas. Finally, on a related but unrelated note, the president also in one of his tweets really attacked the credibility of the FBI and both as an institution and obviously the people there. As a former federal prosecutor, I've never seen anything in that area code before, let alone from the commander-in-chief, who is the commander-in-chief. What was your reaction?
Yeah, I mean, I was, on the one hand, stunned and offended. On the other hand, little sort of stuns me anymore, in the sense that, the president has shown that when anyone gets close to showing him to have made a mistake or do something wrong, he's willing to attack them personally, even if it's his own, chief law enforcement organization. And for the president to throw them under the bus like that, I think is disgraceful.
And it's a sentiment I've heard quite a bit today. Mimi, as always, great job. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Coming up next to the other big story, the Senate passing its tax bill in the dead of night while literally the country woke up the next day to say what happened. We're going to wake you up with some of the cold hard facts of what is in it, and we'll also explain why it's part of a long simmering GOP goal to shrink the role of government. Break it all down straight ahead.